should have mentioned that I didn't turn on the microphone because I'm a novice. Hopefully it's even easier to hear me now. I believe that Misha is remotely recording this service on YouTube, so it will be there in case you know of other people who miss it. And I think I'm going to apologize that this will end up sounding more like a lecture rather than a sermon, but I promise there'll be no quiz at the end of the service. And before I start, you will have noticed two titles in the two-word concepts in the title, namely systemic bias and woke Christianity. And I wanted to define those at the beginning because I'm going to be using those concepts as I also talk about the hymns and in some prayers, and so I'm going to stick a strong introduction here at the beginning. And you know, there are many types of bias in our world. There's racism, sexism, and nationality bias are very important. LGBTQ+ discrimination. And then there are other forms against people with disabilities or with health disadvantages or education. All of these things are in the news constantly these days. And often these biases are associated with blatant acts of discrimination or public statements, and I don't need to highlight those. That's what gets most of the attention in the press. But I want to highlight that, and that's often called overt or blatant racism. But there are also many other types of racism that are maybe a little less visible to us, especially for those of us who are among the privileged class that dominates a lot of decision making. And the first one, the one I'm going to be focusing on, is called systemic bias, which is the institutionalized policies and beliefs of many people who don't consider themselves particularly racist, but which perpetuate the bias and prejudices that are prevalent in our society. And changing this systemic racism is very challenging. And I'm going to be spending time discussing the different ways that it appears in our society. And it's easier to call out the blatant and overt racism. It's harder to look inside at ourselves and our friends and colleagues and recognize the systemic racism which is also there. And to paraphrase the views of my colleague at BU, Imber Kendi, we are all racists. It's only that if we are striving to be anti-racist that we can reduce that element. So that's a very strong statement, but it is a useful one. What about woke Christianity? Our pastor, when he heard my title, he wanted to remind me of his Easter sermon, which many of you heard, in which he talked about Christians needing to recapture woke and awaken and arisen, which have a long biblical origin. Woke has, in the last 40 years, has become more of a terminology of awareness of racism and discrimination, very specifically racism as a African-American concept of I'm woke, and this privileged person might also be woke. And then more recently, it's been broadened to include awareness of gender and sexual orientation and other forms of discrimination. And so from the media, it doesn't seem to me that all Christians are woke. And that perhaps that underlies why so many liberals are disenfranchised with religion. So I think that we as UCC members need to be even more outspoken about what it means to be woke and differentiate ourselves perhaps from some of the other teachings that get emphasized. So I'm going to be touching upon issues of systemic bias in our music, the Bible, and income inequality, education opportunity, economic mentoring and hiring in economics departments, and along the way we may hear hints of actions that we could also consider doing this. So now I move to the call to worship. That was just my introduction. So the call to worship, our first hymn today is Lord, I Want to Be a Christian. And it's actually listed in the hymnal as a African-American spiritual. When I go online to do research, it's perhaps more properly called a Negro spiritual to remind us that it was written by slaves before the Civil War as an emphasis of desiring to become Christians. It wasn't written by privileged people who wanted to strive to become better Christians. It was originated as an African American hymn. And one reason that black slaves were eager to sing and believe in this is that Christians, not being a Christian was one of the rationales used by whites for letting them be slaves. If they became Christians in the early slavery period, they would have to be freed because that was the rationale for treating them in such an ugly way. It evolved later that it didn't matter whether you were Christian, but early on that was important. So, and at that time, many slaves were banned from reading the Bible or going to worship services. It really was quite unfortunate. And in preparing for today, I also learned something else that helps me be a little more woke, which is that these spirituals are also subject to some of the same bias and prejudice of other types, namely the spirituals. If you look at your hymn, it doesn't have any copyright and it doesn't have any ownership at the bottom mentioned, unlike most other hymns. That means that when you print the hymnal, no owner of that song gets any royalties from it. The same is true for the music we sing in our choir, that mostly it has a copyright and we have to pay money to purchase each sheet music and it goes to someone. If we sing a Negro spiritual, there is no revenue going to it. So some churches have decided as an act of improvement that they're going to make a voluntary licensing fee contribution to a charitable organization in compensation for the lack of ownership that they have over that music. It's just an interesting point. So now we're ready to move on to our first hymn, Lord, I Want to Be a Christian. Thank you.
Lord, I want to be a Christian in my heart, in my heart. Lord, I want to be a Christian in my heart, in my heart, in my Lord, I want to be more loving in my heart, in my heart. Lord, I want to be more loving in my heart, in my heart, in my heart. Lord, I want to be more loving in my heart. Lord, I want to be more holy in my heart, in my heart. Lord, I want to be more holy in my heart, in my
Now we can read together the prayer of invocation and hope. Dear God of creation, Joy's going to do this. Excellent, thank you.
This is the prayer of invocation and hope. Dear God of creation, you brought us to life by your word of truth.
In your image, sons and daughters, all colors.
The cancerous wickedness of racism, sexism, and other biases have caused your children to suffer. Prejudice, discrimination, and unwilling complacency have contributed to unhappiness, violence, and even misery and death.
We confess that we have not loved our neighbors as ourselves. We have allowed the sins of racism, sexism, and prejudice to divide us in what we have done and what we have not done, what we have said and what we have not said.
Purify our hearts and tame our tongues, we pray.
Give us courage to repent, fight for righteousness, and to love and embrace one another.
In the name of Jesus Christ, our Savior,
Amen.
Christ's love moves the world toward reconciliation, peace, and unity. Please be seated.
And actually, you don't need to sit down because the next item on our program is the sharing of the peace, a long-time tradition
That was not on my list.
in our church, in which we encourage you to greet people near you. You can do it as you wish by just praying in front of them or saying hi. And it also is an excuse for people who came in and wish to move further forward. It makes us a closer, tighter community to do that. The sharing of the peace. Thanks. Peace, great to see you. Thank you. Great, good to see you. Peace, great to see you. Good. Hey, great to see you, Rosalind. Great, thank you. Thanks, excellent. Thank you for coming. Randy Ellis, very good to meet you. Thank you. Well, come join us. You, be sure you come for coffee afterwards. So you weren't here for our brief introduction. Thank you. Hi, thank you. Great, thank you. Good to see you. Yes, good to see you. Excellent. Great to see you also. Thank you, Liz. Great. Good to remember, yes. The solar window. Thank you very much for reminding me. Yeah. Ken would always mention that.
Okay, now please be seated. For the Old Testament Bible reading, Randy has chosen 3 short passages that are examples of systematic racism and sexism that is pervasive in the Old Testament Bible. The first reading is Exodus 21, verses 1 and 2. Now these are the rules that you shall set before them. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. Notable in the remainder of the passage is that other slaves who are not Hebrew need not be freed after 6 years. The second reading is from Ezra 9, 1 to 2, in a section entitled Denunciation of Mixed Marriages. The people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the people of the lands with their abominations from the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, and the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters to be wives for themselves and for their sons. so that the holy race has mixed itself with the people of the lands. And this faithfulness the land of the officials and chief men have been foremost. The third reading shows Moses' vengeance against women who were bystanders in a war. Numbers 31, 15 through 17. Moses said to them, "Have you let all the women live? Behold, these caused the people of Israel, by the counsel of Balaam, to act treacherously against the Lord in the name of Peor. And so the plague came among the congregation of the Lord. Now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known man by lying with him." All right. The word of the Lord.
Sorry. Okay, for the second hymn, we will be singing hymn number 28, which is actually a Christmas carol, Good Christian Friends Rejoice. It's an inspiring Christmas carol, and we normally sing those in December, and I admire Ken for telling his children and all of us that you can sing Christmas songs all year round. It's also especially appropriate to sing it in July, which in the Southern Hemisphere, in Australia and some other countries, they celebrate a Christmas in July because it lets them cook a turkey and have celebrations related to it being winter, like snow and Christmas trees. Whereas in much of the world, they do not have Christmas in winter. And it's actually a signal of our systemic bias that we northern climate people have this idea that everyone should be thinking about snow and cold in Christmas time, because that wasn't true in Israel, and it's not true in the half of the world that lives below the equator. So let's sing Good Christians, Friends Rejoice, hymn number 28. Great. For the New Testament, I've just used the recommended reading from the lectionary, which ministers get as a crutch to help them choose from among the thousands of different passages that are possible each Sunday. And this is one of my favorites and is well known. It's the parable of the sower, which Jim reminded me is captured in the first window panel behind you with some of the quotes from this passage. And it's Matthew 13. I'm going to use verses 1 through 9 and 18 to 23. That day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea, and great crowds gathered about him, so that he got onto a boat and sat there, and the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, A sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell upon the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where there had not been much soil, and immediately they sprang up, and since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no roots, they withered away. Other seeds fell upon thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. He who has ears, let them hear. No, that is, okay, hear the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in his heart. And this is what was sown along the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is he who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while, and when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately he falls away. And as for what was sown among thorns, this is he who hears the word, but then the cares of the world and the delight of riches choke on the word, and it proves unfruitful. As for what was sown on good soil, this is he who hears the word and understands it, and indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. That brings me to the morning meditation on systemic bias and woke Christianity. Although I've long had an interest in racism and bias, my deeper understanding started about 5 years ago when I read a book by Ijeoma Oluwa, and it was called So You Want to Talk About Race. Her book was written for an audience of both whites and people of color, and examined the causes and impacts of racism on especially people of color. It documents the many occurrences of extreme and obvious full-blown prejudice and acts of racism that frequently make it into the daily news and newspapers. But of particular interest to me was that she also highlighted the cumulative effect of many smaller actions in suppressing and depressing minorities called microaggressions. Not only overt racism, but also microaggressions collectively cause psychological harm, causing health, anxiety, and depression. The minor offenses by people of privilege, she describes, constant suspicions, disapproving looks, insensitive questions, and inquiries about hair or background. These occurring individually may be insignificant, but collectively their repetition by the offending party, typically a white male or person of privilege like myself, has a cumulative effect. I found captivating her characterization of microaggressions as being equivalent to a series of random, repetitive punches on your shoulder as you work through your daily life. And it wears a person out. And this realization that a long series of smaller disadvantages can have as much impact as overt occasional encounters is profound in how we might think about racism. While Oluwa's book emphasized the role that microaggressions play in maintaining racism and sexism, she does not introduce or highlight the newer concept of systemic bias or systemic racism. That became the focus of many subsequent books. Two of my favorites are Ibram Kendi's book on how to be an anti-racist. It really highlights the role of government and institutional policies that perpetuate the problems of racism. And also the best-selling thriller, great book I recommend to you called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, which highlights the commonalities of racism in the United States, both in the American slave era as well as the Jim Crow era that followed it, and had comparable features with the Nazis' treatment of Jews in Germany, and homosexuals also, as well as the Indian caste system of regimented roles for each group of the population that's very, very hard for people to move out. They all have a lot in common. There's also two more books I can't resist mentioning if you really get into learning about racism and especially systemic racism. There's an excellent book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, and it highlights the role the U.S. government, federal and state, but especially federal government, plays in perpetuating racist outcomes. It's maybe more subtle. It's not directly targeted at blacks in all cases, but it has an important impact. And it also discusses sexism and other kinds of biases as well. And then there's a massive tome that was a collective effort at hundreds of different authors called the 1619 Project. It's 624 pages, about 30 hours or so on an Audible book, but it's well worth the listening to because it covers all three types of racism: blatant acts, microaggressions, and systemic racism. So how exactly are biases maintained systemically? Like the parables in the New Testament, it's easier to understand through examples rather than just descriptions. An excellent study was commissioned by the city of Boston to try and understand why there are so few Black, Latino, and female businesses that are winning contracts from the city of Boston for all the things that they do. Imagine the street cleaning, the trash removal, the street repair, the teachers, the salary, the food prepared for teachers, the books and things that the city buys, the paper, the photocopying. All of those are contracted out and do not necessarily get done by public employees. And so this study done in 2021, it was actually completed in 2018, but it took them 3 years to get the courage to release it to the public. And it studied the 5 years of government contracts valued at over $2.2 billion. So this is a sizable impact. And it found that only 0.4% of that amount went to Black American-owned businesses, despite their own assessment that 6.8% of all the businesses in Boston were Black-owned, and the population, they account for 23.5% of the population of Boston. So there's a disconnect between the city not hiring and using its own businesses who are minority to provide all of the services and goods that are bid. Women-owned businesses did slightly better. They got upwards of 8.5% of all contracts, while Hispanic, non-Black, American-owned, and Native Americans cumulatively got less than 1%. So altogether, less than 10% of all the bids were going to non-privileged people, and the remaining 90% were going to white male-owned businesses. They were only about 20% of the population. Just remember, the non-minority, non-female populations. So the nice thing about this study is that it didn't just document the inequities, but it did surveys and tried to understand why. Why is it that minority and women-owned businesses were not able to, or not successful at winning these contracts? And they found 3 contributing factors which are pervasive in other areas, which is one reason why I really like this example. First, an important criteria for winning one of these bids was prior successful contracts with the city. So if you're a minority or a person who has never won a contract with the city, you start out with a number like 20% of the value of your bid is going to be based on, well, what did you do the last time you had a bid? So the lack of a history of success will be held against you. The second is that bidders had to submit extensive paperwork and document their prior businesses, their revenue, their taxes, and all kinds of information. And that's time-consuming, especially if you're not sure, you think you have a low probability of success. And the third one, which is, I think, also most binding, is that they had to make a deposit of 5% of the value of their bid just in order to be considered. That was to show that they were liquid, they were a real firm. So imagine if you were trying to bid on, say, $1 million project, then you would have to deposit $50,000 with this government agency, hoping that you will be successful, even though you may not have any prior history of doing that, and you're not sure whether your taxes and forms were satisfying to the billing agency. So this means that, you know, having to shot at winning a $1 million contract would require you investing $50,000 just on the hope that you could win. Yes, you'll get it back, but not everybody has $50,000 they can afford to tie up in running for a bid. So this lack of prior successes, bureaucratic hassles, and a sizable pre-entry investment that you have to make can largely explain the failure of the city of Boston to overcome the systemic bias of years and years of not having recognized minority and female dominated firm. This is really systemic bias at its worst, really. And woke political leaders, including Michelle Wu, who is the mayor where I live in the South End, are trying to improve this, but it's not easy because it's baked into all the rules that they have about things that have to be done for accepting contracts. It requires getting the legislature and the city to change the rules of the game. Another example of systemic bias that relates to college admissions has been in the media a great deal in the last few weeks because the Supreme Court just ruled that universities can no longer use race as a consideration in admitting college students. In doing so, the court is essentially denying that there is any remaining race problem or a problem to be fixed in the United States. Now, I want to hurry to say that I think that this is a very controversial issue. It's not a slam dunk. It's a very controversial issue because there are definitely negative effects of affirmative action on the beliefs of both the minorities as well as on the privileged people to which it can have an impact. And particularly, the issue is that one of the features of systemic bias is they're maintaining a belief that some group is inferior or not as good, even though there may be no evidence of that. And the affirmative action program may foster that kind of excuse and beliefs. But I think it is also true that going to the other extreme, and it was a very broad interpretation, they eliminated its use in all kinds of ways, and I think that they may find that that may seem too strong in the long run, especially because it can affect other kinds of decisions. And let me give one example of how this kind of systemic racism is at play even in today's universities. I'm going to talk about Harvard because it was in the articles that came out just in the last 2 weeks. Harvard currently admits a little less than 20% of their students because they are alumni children. Okay? An additional 10% of the student body as freshmen at Harvard are admitted because their families made large donations to Harvard. You can still buy your way into top universities if you want to donate $1 million, say, or maybe less. Okay? You can also, there's about 20% of the Harvard student freshmen are admitted because they get athletic scholarships. You may recall that there have been a lot of publicity of some court cases of wealthy families buying access to those scholarships. I don't think that's the dominant form of a biased selection that's going on. But it is true that if you look at who gets the scholarships, it's predominantly white privileged students who come out of strong suburban schools. One of my other research topics that I have not found a student willing to work on yet is to look at the bias of the Boston Globe's use of scholar athlete awards that they do 3 times a year. And I get there, it's on the front page of a whole section of the Boston Globe showing 290 wonderful high school children who are recommended as getting scholarships when they apply to college based on their sports. And the nice thing about seeing all those pictures is you can look at, okay, how many boys are there, how many girls are there, how many of them are black, how many of them are Latino, how many are Asian, and so on. And the interesting thing is that there's an equal number of men and boys and girls now, because the Globe realizes, well, we can't be overtly biased. And so they have a lot of women's sports. They are well represented now in high school sports, but they get equal number of front page coverage of their pictures and awards. But on the other hand, I go through it, and when I scan the pictures, I find that less than 3% of the people who are nominated as scholar athletes are African origin, appearing to be black. And there's some, that's including some black Hispanic names. They give the name as well, so you can also judge the nationality of the name, not of the person. And so the interesting thing that is 96%, or I think 94% of the pictures on that Boston Globe annual report on scholarship recommendations are not minority gender or not minority races. And that's surprising because when you watch professional sports or college sports, there's almost a majority. There's like often 30-40% of all the athletes are minority candidates. So there's a disconnect between how many are getting at least in the Boston area, chosen for these. So that I view as part of the Harvard story, that they can choose people from suburbs who are like themselves, which I'll return to. So giving preference to people who are first-generation college enrollees or coming from lower income can change admissions somewhat, but it may not fully rectify the effects of past inequities. And there is empirical evidence, economists and others have studied, that the states that have dropped or added this college affirmative action have had mix. Some cases they've maintained their ratio of minorities. In other cases there have been dramatic drops. So it will be a very impactful impact. This gets me to talk about my own currently funded and active research area, which is looking at systemic bias in universities in the way they recruit, mentor, train, place, hire, and promote new PhDs in economics departments. So this is very personal. I observe a lot of systemic bias in my own department and in the economics field where I work. And I'm focusing on the top 100 departments, and that's easier because they are all publishing a lot, they're more similar, and they also train more than 40% of all future professors. So the pipeline of people coming out as new PhDs is a signal of who will be hired in future years. And in economics departments like Harvard and MIT and at BU, about 40% of all the PhD students are female, which has been about the same for the last 20 years. It's not like we're having this huge crescendo. It's been quite solid at 40 to 50% at most universities for quite some time. And yet there's still the case that only 15 to 23% of the faculty at these top universities are women. And it's an even smaller fraction when you look at the number of women and minorities who are making it to be full professors. So at BU, we have the same number of tenured full professors today as there were when I was hired at BU in 1981. So that's 40 years with very small change in number of tenured senior professored women at places like Boston University. And that's concerning because it would take 100 years and you still won't see much change in that dimension. And we also have 0 African Americans on our faculty. We have a small number of Latino origin faculty, all trained in Latin America, not initially starting out as disadvantaged American minority Latino students. So the question about why is this true in academics? Well, in some ways, it's the same answer as the city of Boston, because we have a very long history of producing white males and majority people who are going to be the training of the future generations. And then it relates to this concept of homophily. It's an important concept of network theory. People prefer to spend time working or playing or having fun with people who are more like themselves. And this is a natural property of humans that they prefer hanging out with people like themselves. And it also in economics, there's sort of this belief that these people that I hang out with are better. See, that's the dangerous part, that just because you enjoy hanging out with some type of people is fine, but it doesn't mean you should then recommend only those type of people when you are trying to hire them or to train them or help them get jobs. So there's many reasons for this, but I think the dominant reason is that economists are very good at having strong beliefs to justify their own actions and behaviors. And so it's hard to change that kind of outcome. And it may be that they could discover, I could be just as productive co-authoring with a black or a woman or another minority as I am working with the people who I've been working with in the past. And it might even be more fun. But one thing is pretty clear is that discovery won't happen unless they change their networks of who they work with, who they interact with. So I want to just express some joy and glee that we have a number of African Americans who have started joining us, and we have a few more Asians. We are becoming a slightly more diverse church after 100 years of being less so. So the rate of change has been striking and is wonderful, and I only wish that our economics departments could be as successful as this church, at least, has already been, and maybe we'll be able to continue to build on. So far, this has been a very academic kind of sermon. You can see I'm talking like concepts I could use in an economics talk. But I admit that I have been sparing you the mathematics, the statistics, and the technical models that I use in my academic work. But what is the connection of this to the other part of my sermon, being a woke Christian, or woke Christianity? And my preparation for this sermon actually helped me a lot achieving a better understanding of the answer to that question, because I like to think I'm a woke person. I know I'm still biased and I have a lot of latent systemic bias. One of the nice things about Kindy's and Isabel Wilkerson's book is they encourage people to speak out among their colleagues or about somebody of a different majority-minority group to point out racism and, or bias in subtle ways. You don't have to do it in an embarrassing way, but I'm sure I say things that are offensive, and I apologize, but it's just part of our background. But woke Christianity. I benefited by reading a book by a very well-known progressive economist named Sam Bowles. He's at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, which is known for having a radical, almost socialist department, teaching a lot of unconventional thoughts in economics. I'm not saying the whole campus, but in economics, that is their niche. And his book title was The Moral Economy: Why Good Incentives Are No Substitute for Good Citizens. Okay? The usual economist and political science framework for policymaking is that policies affect outcomes. We all believe that. The government policies and individual firm policies, Harvard's policies, they affect the outcomes. This means that if you want to affect outcomes, you should find a policy that it serves it the best, that achieves it the best. A slightly more elaborate version that is that policies affect decisions and decisions affect outcomes. That's still incomplete. The modern view of economists would be more like this. Policies affect beliefs, and beliefs affect decisions, and decisions affect outcomes. So let me repeat that. Policies affect beliefs, beliefs affect decisions, and decisions affect outcomes. So if I were in a classroom, I would absolutely have this on a PowerPoint slide, and I would have a little image that has arrows, and I'd say policies arrow or change beliefs, policies, and then beliefs change decisions, and decisions change outcomes. So the interesting thing is that both microaggressions and systemic biases can make changing beliefs really difficult. So when you do microaggressions, you feel justified in acting the way you are, and the people that you might be affecting are responding in the way that is often done, of getting depressed or withdrawn or not feeling as confident and having all kinds of negative impacts on their own beliefs, and beliefs about themselves and beliefs about the majority class. So still, what about religion? Aha! The moment of realization is that religion also changes beliefs. So if we want, we could say religion changes beliefs that affect decisions that change outcomes. Or we could rephrase the whole scenario where we are as policies plus religion define beliefs that affect decisions and change outcomes. So if we want to change racism, we could have religion trying to help formulate and change the policies that are going to impact the beliefs and decisions. Now, this direct implication of religion are profound, since religion also changes beliefs, and religion can help us to choose our leaders, choose different or better leaders, and help us support policies that reinforce socially desirable outcomes. Now, I have to admit, it's been a little sad being a Christian over the last 10 years or 2 decades roughly, because not all Christians support the same beliefs that most of us in this congregation do. There are a lot who do not place the same importance on issues of social justice that I believe in. And I don't want to turn this into a sermon about evangelicals, but there are too many Christians who are still looking at the biased teachings of the Old Testament that I highlighted a few, and there are so many more about, horribly racist, sexist, misogynist, homophobic, xenophobic statements in the Old Testament. And that's why I love the New Testament, because it has a different emphasis on lots and lots of things. So in my mind, the Old Testament can be used to support racism, sexism, slavery, misogyny, and more. What we need are more socially minded, active Christians following the precepts of the United Church of Christ, the UCC, such as we have here in our community, which is open and affirming, and God is still speaking. I open to new ideas and expressions from God. And in closing, I'm very proud of what we have in the UCC, and this church specifically, and has a history of leading by making progressive, socially minded decisions. Since some of you one or two of you are just visiting, let me highlight that things that you might not know. In 1783, Massachusetts was the first state to vote to abolish slavery, and that was done largely with the support and leadership of its many churches, of which it was overwhelmingly congregational churches. We were the first state led by the most progressive churches in the country. In 1839, New England United Church of Christ churches funded and led the legal defense of the Amistad slave ship, which originated and landed in Connecticut. And it was the first successful slave revolt that freed Africans and helped them return home. They actually sent 35 people back to Africa once the court hearings that were presided over, or the defense lawyer was John Quincy Adams, a retired president from Boston, Massachusetts. I didn't look up whether he was in a UCC congregation, but I wouldn't be surprised. And in now I'm jumping way ahead. There was all kinds of events that I can't document easily. In 1970, the Newton Highlands Congregational Church had already called a husband and wife team of pastors to lead our worship services. And they served as joint pastors for about 15 or 20 years, like others would know. In the 1990s, the Newton Highland Congregational Church was among the first churches in the state to become open, affirming, welcoming gay and lesbian members, and calling a lesbian associate pastor in the 1990s, who served here for more than a decade. And twice in the 2000s, Newton Hans Congregational Church broadened the set of LGBTQ plus folks that we explicitly mention in our charter as being welcomed into our congregation. And we've also hosted multiple LGBTQ marriages, and one of my favorite events, the Gay Men's Chorus, was a sellout performance in our congregation. And perhaps during the 2020s, we will decide we want to find some new mission to add to that historic of success, of progressive success. And it is very much a Christian issue of how much discontent and happiness there is among women and men and gay and lesbians and other kinds of minorities. And maybe we can find ways of addressing the systemic biases that are still pervasive in our society. And that is finally the end of my sermon. So now I'd like to do the call to offering. And Joy and I will collect the offering while Evgenia. Thank you, God, for these gifts, which we are able to share with the church and with your guidance, decide how we can better help the world. Thank you. So, I want to start with the pastoral prayer and invite anybody who has any prayers that they wish to make us aware of people with sad or good or anything that you'd like to share. Please speak out.
My friend Penny.
Friend Kenny. Penny. Mm-hmm. people in Vermont who have been subject to massive flooding. Yes, Liz? I'm sorry. Right. Thank you. Anyone else? I want to add the people who are suffering from all the mines that have been placed in Ukraine. It's very depressing. Great. So, thank you for these prayers for Penny and for people in Vermont and the people who I could not quite hear, the people in Ukraine and others that are in your thoughts and prayers. O Lord, mercifully receive the prayers of these people who are called upon you, and grant that they may know and understand what things they ought to do, and also may have the grace and power faithfully to accomplish them through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. And now we can join together in saying the Lord's Prayer. Our Father and Mother, blessed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. I have a closing prayer. Dear God, help us to other forms of our own lives. We begin to understand that these problems of discrimination are not just the result of extremists who we can easily recognize and condemn, but are also embedded in many of our institutions, traditions, and day-to-day beliefs and actions. Microaggressions and work toward changing the policies that underlie systemic bias. Give us the strength to work towards changing these attitudes and behaviors by ourselves and others, which cause great pain, mental anguish, inequity, and loss of well-being.
Onward, Christian soldiers, marching off to war.
Thank you for coming today and for listening to these complex thoughts about racism and its many forms. May you leave and ponder further and discuss with your friends how you too might become more aware of microaggressions or systemic biases in your lives or in those of the people around you. Thank you.